Alright, I know that some of you don't really care about being innovators, and you just want to know what the damage meta is overall. And for you, I will not hold your time any longer than I have to. You will want to use Finality's Augur with the Catalyst, and Mint Retrograde with an ammo restoration and a damage perk. If you don't want to do that, or you don't have the Finality's Augur Catalyst, use New Malpai or Choir of One and Heavy GL Dumping. Now, for everyone else, here's how to get your friends asking what the hell were you using for damage on the mission complete overview screen. This video is for intermediate to advanced players looking to take their DPS loadouts to another level of skill. I'm assuming that you have some kind of basic familiarity with the game, knowledge of weapons, basic build crafting, and maybe a little bit of endgame experience. If that describes you, you're in the right place. If that doesn't describe you, I still hope the information in this video is going to be useful to you in some way. Just understand that you may not be the direct target audience. I guess you're like the splash damage target audience or something? I don't know. Just keep in mind you may already know some of the information presented in here. However, before I can get into it, there is a massive necessary disclaimer, which is that I will be assuming 0 loadout or armor swaps. Can you optimize your damage even harder by utilizing loadout swaps? Yes. However, some players either don't want to or can't loadout swap for any number of reasons. The latter situation typically applies to players on lower end hardware or consoles for whom loadout swaps are significantly less efficient due to higher load times. On top of that, the damage loss from inefficient or outright failed loadout swaps is almost always more than the potential DPS gains from loadout swapping. If you want to loadout swap, feel free to, but if you're the kind of person that's setting up loadout swaps, I question how much this video is gonna do for you. However, before we start actually building for damage, we need to understand what we're actually building for. DPS or total damage. DPS stands for damage per second and is, well, it's exactly that. It's the amount of damage that you can do every second. The term often gets thrown around where it's not applicable in the truest sense. What are we doing for DPS phase? Where are we standing for DPS? Then we do the DPS phase, so on and so forth. High DPS is much more important on shorter damage phases, with Aatrox 1 and the right side kill lock set being the most extreme examples, with their damage phases lasting mere seconds, favoring high DPS burst strategies like T-Crash, Parasite, and Lament. DPS is also used to describe the average efficiency of a given strategy over its full duration, so don't be surprised to see it in that context as well. Total damage is the theoretical total damage of a strategy given infinite time. Total damage tends to be favored on longer damage phases where you can actually get through all of your ammo in a damage phase. Total damage weapons tend to be highly ammo efficient but have lower average DPS the shorter the damage window is. Corrupted Puppeteer, Golgoroth, and pretty much everything in the Desert Perpetual favor high total damage strategies like Dragon's Breath, Thunderlord, and Grand Overture because of how long their damage phases are. When deciding which is more important, the biggest question to ask is, will I be able to reasonably use all of my ammo? And if the answer is yes, consider swapping to a higher total damage option. Question is, what are the options that I should use? And, well, there's a lot of nuance there. When it comes time to put lead down range, most players are going to rely on a single weapon damage strategy. Single weapon damage is just that. Damage from a single weapon. The prep for the damage phase is probably just popping your super, pulling out your power weapon, and going to town. This will usually come from sources that incentivize you to keep using the same weapon over an extended period of time. This includes things like Thunderlord, Grand Overture, Whisper of the Worm, Queenbreaker, and Sleeper Simulant, though keep in mind, that list is not exhaustive. The strategy for these weapons mostly comes down to shoot the gun and hit your crits when applicable. The advantage that these strategies have over more involved ones is that they're not involved. There are less moving parts, which means much less opportunity to fumble the bag. Yeah, a missed Whisper crit hurts, but it's not the end of the world. These weapons also tend to have some kind of ammo restoration inbuilt, meaning they also tend to have pretty good to excellent total damage. However, with the sheer variety of weapons we have in the game, we're no longer restricted to just doing damage with one weapon. Combining this with perks incentivizing the use of multiple weapons, and you have a whole new way to do damage: rotations. A damage rotation involves cycling or rotating between two or more of your weapons, typically taking advantage of ammo restoration and damage perks that reward the use of multiple weapons. While these strategies are much more involved and therefore have a much higher chance of fumbling the bag, they also tend to have a much higher ceiling in terms of average DPS. Rotations also tend to have a much higher mix of weapon and ability damage, since the rotation between multiple weapons provides distinct breakpoints at which abilities can be weaved into your strategy. Having said that, the flexibility and creative freedom that comes with the multitude of rotations available, it can feel daunting to even approach the concept as a newer player. However, when you examine the rotations that see use and success, they tend to fall into one of two patterns, and from there it becomes much easier to experiment and understand how to develop a damage rotation. Damage rotations pretty much always fall into either a burst DOT rotation or a double burst rotation. Burst DOT rotations utilize a damage over time, or DOT, weapon to deal consistent tick damage in the background of an active source of damage. This is by far more common, but that's mostly because DOT options are also more common than viable double burst options. Popular DOT options include Dragon's Breath, Anarchy, Finality's Augur, Wither Horde, Area Denial GLs, and New Malpai. Yes, New Malpai counts as a DOT option, since leaving the rounds in to explode later does work as DOT. However, do keep in mind, some DOT options, namely Wither Horde, Dragon's Breath, and Area Denial GLs, stack very poorly when used by multiple people. So if you're using one of those, you gotta claim it early or figure something else out. Those three are strictly one-ofs per fire team. Everything else stacks just fine, but keep in mind future options may suffer the same issue, so just, be ready for it. First options are far more meta-dependent and will also depend on what slot your DOT weapon is in. If you have a DOT power weapon, obviously you want a special burst weapon, and vice versa. What option you choose will largely be meta and preference dependent, but I hope to provide a few options in both slots to keep this video somewhat evergreen. In your special slot, you're looking at stuff like Mint Retrograde, Kratos' Revenge, the Supremacy, and very rarely Trench Barrel Shotguns. In your heavy slot, Outrageous Fortune is great, though heavy GLs in general are fantastic. Rockets like Hezen Vengeance, linears like Cataclysmic, but really any well-rolled legendary DPS weapon gets the job done. There are a lot of good heavy DPS weapons that can be rolled or spec'd for DPS, and with time you will learn what those roles are. Those roles are also largely applicable to the next rotation type, the double burst rotation. Double burst rotations utilize two different burst weapons to proc perks on legendary weapons that would grant more damage than using either alone. We've already talked about a bunch of heavy weapons that can be used, but what about our other burst weapons? Unfortunately, those options are a lot less plentiful. The main two special burst weapons are Izanagi's Burden and New Land Beyond. Choir of One does make an appearance in some rotations, but it's not as common to see, especially without double special, which I recommend against for reasons I explain later. Double burst rotations aren't nearly as common nowadays, since DOT sources are really strong right now, at least when the video is coming out, and are also plentiful enough that you'll almost definitely find one that fits your needs. Now, if you are the kind of person that's taking notes, which is not required, but I am glad that you're learning, you will probably be asking the question, what about double DOT rotations? And the answer is, they all suck. Okay, but on a more serious note, there are some problems with it fundamentally. First of all, DOT weapons are balanced around being a passive source of damage and therefore have much lower peak damage than burst counterparts. For an example of what happens when DOT weapons aren't balanced this way, Beyond Light Anarchy. Yeah, back when slug shotguns were good. The other problem is that with 2 DOT weapons, you're gonna just kind of be standing there like an idiot during the damage phase. Active damage options offer much more DPS and total damage, since DPS phases aren't actually infinite. So yeah, stick to at least 1 burst weapon. Speaking of burst weapons, you're gonna want some of those, so let's talk perks. Obviously, for exotics, you don't need to worry about rolls or perk combinations, except for exotics that have multiple catalysts, but those are all craftable anyway. However, legendary weapons are a different story. They may have any number of barrels, magazines, perks, and origin traits that make the task of target farming for one feel daunting at best and overwhelming at worst. I can't mention every perk to hunt for, but here are some that I would recommend. To note, most perk combinations fall into an ammo restoration perk and a damage perk. Some exceptions do apply, typically double ammo restoration perks on special weapons that are spec'd more for longevity than peak DPS, but your mileage may vary. The absolute god tier perks for damage rotations are, to absolutely nobody's surprise, Envious Arsenal and Bait and Switch. This role alone makes pretty much any weapon it's on top tier at worst and god tier at best. We're already using 2 of our weapons to do damage, so pulling out your primary and tapping the boss with any bullet to get a free reload and 30% damage bonus is a no-brainer. While those perks are often the target farm, they aren't always available or may not be the best option for your rotation, so here are some alternatives to look for in that case. In terms of ammo restoration, Rewind Rounds is a great, absolutely brainless option. While it's less potent than Envious Arsenal, it's usually enough to get you through a damage phase, or it's used in double restoration setups to shoot an unholy amount of ammo without having to reload. It also has a funny interaction with burst weapons that shoot more than 1 instance of damage per ammo, like Mint Retrograde and Adaptive Burst Linears, that restore more ammo than otherwise possible, so it's really good on those. Auto-loading holster is a bit of a dated option, but for DOT weapons, it gets the job done fine enough. Just keep in mind, it does take a fair amount of time to proc, so if you're going too fast, you may want or need another option. Triple tap and 4th times the charm is used on precision weapons like linears and snipers to extend the amount of time you can fire without reloading, as well as generating ammo, which helps a lot on faster firing weapons like rapid fire snipers, or for sustained damage phases in which you are much more likely to get through all of your ammo. In terms of damage perks, we've already gone over Bait and Switch, but I will make a note about it here that while it is one of the highest damage bonuses in the game, it's balanced by the fact that you can't refresh it, so you gotta make sure to re-up it when it runs out, especially if you have more than 1 weapon with Bait and Switch. Elemental Honing actually outperforms Bait and Switch at max, even on non-kinetic weapons, but you do need to have 4 of the 5 damage types to make it worth, and ideally all 5. So it's pretty much for prismatic only, since hitting that number elsewise is difficult at best. Bait and Switch and Elemental Honing are the only 2 that I can in good faith recommend if they're available, but if you don't have access to them, either because they aren't available on your weapon of choice or because you just haven't gotten a roll with them, here's a quick list of perks that I can certify aren't throw picks. Firing Line, Focused Fury, One for All, but only if you can reliably proc it, and Vorpal Weapon for special weapons, or if you are very desperate. Vorpal Weapon is just not that good on heavy weapons because it scales down depending on your ammo type. Now that we have our weapons and overall gun-based strategy set up, we get to the part that most people consider the actual build crafting, which is our armor and our subclass. We're going to start with mods, since that's much more straightforward, and then we're getting into the weeds with classes and subclasses. In terms of fundamentals, armor mods are all about increasing your damage and minimizing your downtime. Surge mods are absolutely, positively number 1 when it comes to mods for DPS. Surge mods turn your static armor charge into decaying armor charge, and while you have armor charge, weapons of matched surge elements get a bonus damage. I highly recommend splitting your surge mods between your 2 main damage types unless one of those elements is doing far more damage, since multiple Surge mods give diminishing returns. I find running 2 Surge mods is better value, since I get to have a full stat mod, which enables 200 super, but if triple stacking works better for you, go for it. Just keep in mind you will be losing out on scav mods. Speaking of Surge mods, you will definitely find the Decaying Armor Charge Timer restrictive without at least 1 Time Dilation mod in your class item. I'm personally at 2 since I think it's the sweet spot for keeping up surges during damage. 3 is probably overkill, since if you have a Wall of Radiance on your team, you will be getting max armor charge, but that is entirely your call depending on how good your uptime is. Finally, dexterity is not necessary, but is very nice to have, especially if your rotation relies on doing a lot of swaps. Switching between weapons takes time, and that's time you could be doing damage. I once again recommend splitting your elements between your 2 damage weapons, or if they're the same element, split between that and your primary to avoid getting got by diminishing returns. Armor mods are universal, but subclasses are not. We're going to be doing this one by one, going through each subclass for every class that I can in good faith recommend. Keep in mind that another subclass may at some point become viable, but I can't talk about what's going to happen in the future since I only exist in 3 dimensions and not 4, but that's just tough beans. The only subclass that I can in good faith recommend outside of some extreme circumstances for hunters is Prismatic. Everything that can be even slightly considered as viable for DPS is available on Prismatic, and in my opinion, it's got the best fragment options available, and you'll see it recommended on all 3 classes for that reason. The most evergreen setup that I can recommend for Prismatic is Golden Gun with Celestial Nighthawk, spec'd for as high a super stat as possible. Facet of Dawn is an absolute must for Radiant. Courage is also a staple since Prismatic supers do count as abilities and will therefore benefit from the 10% damage bonus from Facet of Courage. Ruin is here if you are on Duskfield like I am, since both it and your Transcendent Grenade benefit from increased damage. In terms of weaving your abilities in, the quintessential combo for Hunters is Melee Grenade Chain that also applies on Warlock, but we'll get to that in a second. Your melee ability is technically wide open, but I recommend either Threaded Spike or the Dinker. I don't actually remember the name of this as I was writing this script, and it's way funnier to call it the Dinker, but this thing. I recommend opening up your rotation by doing a melee grenade combo into your super, letting that rip, and then popping trance to do guns, and just cycling it forward. If you don't have your abilities, just let Transcendence rip, melee grenade into super, and then get right to it with guns. Gunslinger can be pushed to the side unless you are in an instance where dealing damage to multiple targets is important, like Ranix from Vesper's Host, or in situations where a high amount of a non-precision burst damage is needed, which I think only applies to Atrax 1, since Atrax has a unique model that takes reduced crit damage. Having said that, there's no telling what the future holds, so for those situations, you will want Blade Barrage with Star Eater scales. Bungie clearly is not going to shy away from multiple targets linking to the same health bar, so I would say it's something that's worth having in your back pocket. I'm not getting too into the weeds, and specking for damage on this setup is pretty hard. Ember of Eruption is nice for bigger booms, but past that, it's a pretty standard solar build in terms of everything else. Searing and Mercy to kickstart some Resto, Torches to keep the knife spam part of the build actually working, and knock him down since you need that for Blade Barrage to be decent anyway, and from there, it's all dealer's choice. But if it's not a Blade Barrage moment, just stick to Prismatic. Blade Barrage is really only good when Golden Gun is near useless, and the amount of times that happens is very small. In the footnote section here, I will mention Tether, since it occupies a very unique support role, that being the coveted 30% weaken, which is only available on Raptor Cannon and this super as far as I'm aware. There's not really a whole lot to spec for. Let your Tether rip, pop trance, and then just go nuts. For Titans, as it turns out, Prismatic is also really good. The classic Consecration Frenzy Blade build is still out in full swing. You just gotta swap out your Spirit of Syntho for, I don't know, Armamentarium, probably? I'm getting in the weeds. The build still works. However, for DPS purposes, you won't be on an exotic class item anyway. You'll be doing, say it with me, Virus of the Falling Star with Thunder Crash. Facet of Courage is excellent here too, but in terms of actually speccing for damage, there's not a whole lot to optimize for. All of the abilities on Prismatic Titan are just not that great in terms of weaving them in for a rotation. The only thing that really needs to be talked about is Thunder Crash timing. Thunder Crash is, at the time of writing this, the highest burst damage super in the game, assuming you have Quirus and don't miss. The downside is that Thunder Crash displaces you in a rather severe manner. This displacement is usually a DPS loss, either because you lose damage from your team's Well of Radiance, a friendly Bolt Charge barricade, or worse, you risk instant death in some fights, either because of mechanics or just where the boss is. For basically every other super, best practice is to pop as early as possible, since you want all of the damage you're doing to contribute to the next one. But for Thunder Crash, popping it without a plan can lead to less than desirable results. For longer damage phases, when generating multiple Thunder Crashes is possible, the earlier advice applies, since 2 Thunder Crashes is better than 1. However, if you think that the possibility of generating a second Thunder Crash is little to none, hold your T-Crash until near the end of the damage phase, and then crash as close to immunity as you can safely get away with. Keep in mind, you're still going to need to deal with any wipe mechanics related to the immunity, so leave ample time for that. But Prismatic is only for the Titans on the team past the first. So what's the first guy doing? Well, to nobody's surprise, Striker Titan. Largely the same as the Falling Star Thunder Crash setup, but this time with Storm's Keep. That's right, you too can experience a taste of what Wellocks get to experience by being the team's base. Only a small taste though, since your job is to drop a rally barricade backwards from wherever your team is doing damage. There really isn't a whole lot to say, so on to the footnotes, that being Pyrogale. Sunbreaker right now is literally not Striker Titan, so it's not seeing as much use, but I do want to touch on it because it's definitely going to be nice to have in your back pocket. It is solar, so you're not really going to be able to spec for damage too hard, but make sure to have Roaring Flames in your build, since it's a very free damage boost to the big Bonk Hammer. Oh, and I guess I kind of forgot to say this, but you do need to have Pyrogale on. Technically, the build is wide open after that, but I personally recommend the classic Bonk Titan build, built around Roaring Flames and Sunspots with Soul Invictus, and then you just spec for survivability with your Fragment. To absolutely nobody's surprise at all, your team is going to want at least one Dawnblade Warlock with Well of Radiance. This thing has been in the game for 8 years and has been good for exactly, literally all of them. Having said that, Well of Radiance may not always be the best option for your team, even if they don't already have one. The magic formula to have in your back pocket is value equals time multiplied by players. So when shouldn't you use Well of Radiance? Well, the answer is if you're not going to be able to get most or all of your team in the well for most or all of its duration. On traditional damage phases like Riven, Nezarec, and Karev, where all of your team is going to be in the well for an entire damage phase, it is, in a way, one of the highest damage supers in the game. Not going to show on the wipe screen, but you skim 25% off the top of everyone else's damage and add it to yours, all of a sudden, you're making biscuits. However, when your team is not able to be in the well for a large portion of the damage phase, you're better off swapping to another option that I'll go over in a minute. In a fight like Caretaker, where your team needs to stand in a very specific spot to do damage, and then that spot changes, you're not going to get nearly as much damage out of Well of Radiance. But if you thought you weren't going to be doing an unholy amount of damage just because you're on Dawnblade, yeah, think again. You're throwing on Starfire Protocol. The build is all about throwing grenades, doing damage with guns, and then a whole lot more of that. Touch of Flame and Hellion are damn near mandatory since it's just free damage for no extra work. And then Ember of Ashes for more ignitions, and then spec for your preferred form of healing. The actual strategy, ability-wise, is just simple as all get out. Drop your Well, pop your Emperor for Hellion, huck out 2 grenades, and then do your rotation as normal, throwing grenades whenever you've got them, and you have a breakpoint in your rotation. For literally everyone else that's on Warlock, either because Well of Radiance isn't viable, or because you're a duplicate, you want to be on Prismatic. In order to even be considered in terms of damage, you will want to be on Nova Bomb with a Spirit of the Star Eater class item. And if you don't have the class item, that's just tough beans for you. There's not really an alternative here. Hi there, Onyx from the future. The majority of this video was recorded before the Meta-Idoxia changes were previewed. You'll probably still want to be on Prismatic for it, but hey, we might actually see Needlestorm as a damage super, and Warlocks will be getting their first damage increasing super exotic in 11 years. Hellion is damn near a must since it is free damage for just using your class ability, and your other aspect can be just about anything, but to nobody's surprise, I recommend Feed the Void because, yeah, let's be real, Devour is still just one of the most broken OP things in this game. For your abilities, Arcane Needle is a must. Unravel is free damage, and Needle is the most free source of it. Vortex Grenade is something I strongly recommend due to some synergy with the subclass that I'll go over later, but it's not needed at all. You can pick anything. I'm just min-maxing. Then again, the whole video is min-maxing, so I don't know, pick and choose your battles. Phoenix Dive is probably the best class ability since it has a shorter cooldown and a very natural flow in the ability weave, but if you don't have the muscle memory for it, it may be better for you to just be on Healing Rift. In terms of your fragments, Justice is just 10% extra Nova Bomb damage. The boss is going to be unraveled anyway. Dominance is great to have since your team might not have a 30% weaken, and in that scenario, 15% for the team is excellent. This is also why I recommended Vortex Grenade earlier, but even if you're not on Vortex Grenade, your Prismatic Grenade does count as a Void Grenade and will apply Void Weaken. Finally, Facet of Command is excellent for some free reload since your Prismatic Grenade freezes and is a very part of the ability weave I recommend. For your last fragment, or fragments if you're not on Hellion, I am on Justice for the stat boost so that I can have some extra grenade stat via a piece of Grenadier armor, but obviously if you don't need that, you should go for something else. Now, Prismatic Warlock rotations especially tend to look like an arcane thicket of ability spam and button presses, so I'll try to demystify that here and go over the way I like to weave. One of the essentials is the Needle Grenade combo that is also useful on Hunter. Normally, Needle has a pretty long period of end lag before you can use guns again, but you can cancel this via a grenade, meaning getting the muscle memory for it is good practice if you plan on being on Warlock. Tie everything in. Here's how I do my abilities. Start off damage, I do Needle Grenade, Jump, then Nova Bomb, Phoenix Dive for Hellion, pop Transcendence, do another Needle Grenade, and then get right to it with guns. Needle Grenade is great to re-up anytime you get the chance, but don't let that be overly disruptive to the rest of your rotation. I'd only recommend doing this even when it's not disruptive to do so, and even if your Transcendence isn't active, it's still worth it since grenade damage is grenade damage. Now that I've fried your brain with all of the juicy details, let's get a lot less specific and move to some general damage tips that are going to apply regardless of what you're doing. The number one thing that you can do for yourself to increase your damage is practice. If you're new to the whole damage rotation thing, you will not have the muscle memory to perform these rotations, and with how involved they get, building muscle memory is very important. Any unnecessary delays in swapping weapons is a DPS loss, and you don't want to be fumbling around come raid night because you don't know what the hell you're doing. Having said that, these rotations can get kind of insane, and trying to learn everything all at once can feel daunting, so if you're overwhelmed, simplify and then practice from there. If you're not already in the muscle memory of proccing bait and switch, start there. After that, you just gotta loop it around with something like Wither Horde. I actually recommend starting with Wither Horde since it's a solid way to get into the rotation, since it's a special weapon which you can actually use during the encounter because it's very ammo efficient, and auto-loading is much more forgiving than Envious Arsenal if you miss. Also, it's getting buffed next patch, so that's pretty cool too. Don't even worry about using your abilities yet. Stick to just guns until you've got the solid muscle memory down. I actually recommend removing dexterity mods if you're just starting out, since that gives you more time between components of your rotation. Once you're in the habit of looping around with bait and switch, you can scale up from there, adding a double Envious proc via damage over time. This is where you damage the boss with your other two weapons, swap to only your primary, let the DOT from your special or heavy weapon tick, and then instantly switch back to your active DPS weapon. You can sometimes even get a triple proc if your DOT ticks for long enough, but that is something you're going to have to mess around with. Somewhere in there, you can start messing around with your abilities. If there's ever a point where your damage buff is about to run out, toss out some abilities and then just refresh it. Also, don't be afraid to look at the bottom left of your screen. In the heat of the moment, things get very hectic, and you're going to want to know if bait and switch runs out, or if you get something like a facet of command reload. Running off of muscle memory is great, and it's a fantastic fallback to have when shit hits the fan. But in the moment, anything could happen, and you gotta be ready for it. The shooting range is damn near perfect for this purpose. You just need to not have a fire team to practice your rotation. Hop in the range, load up Carl, and just go to town. The main thing that a rotation has over single weapon damage is that it minimizes downtime. But every second that you aren't doing some kind of damage is a second you could be doing damage. This is the reason that weaving abilities is so useful on Hunter and Warlock. You're minimizing the amount of downtime that you spend that isn't doing something damage related. Obviously 100% uptime is difficult, if not impossible, but generally you want your DOT to be active as much as possible. If you've got Wither Horde, shoot it off first. Same thing with Area Denial GLs. If you're on Finality Augur, you want that turret to be in target mode as soon as possible. The number one thing that I can encourage when you are making your rotation is to get creative. Understand that what you try may not necessarily work, but you will learn more from your failure than you do from success. Don't be afraid to look a little silly in the shooting range, because unless you're making a video, ain't nobody gonna see it. Having said that, don't go off the deep end. Keep each component of your rotation to solid, viable picks. Conditional finality is great, and I love it, but I'm not whipping it out for the DPS rotation. Look for things that either spec very well for damage or have the potential to fill a slot that you need in your rotation. Having said that, my recommendation is that if you're watching this video, one primary weapon, one special weapon. No other setup. Double special is much harder to do now, and you need to be on a pretty specific setup to do so. You will see some people on double special, but those setups utilize very ammo gen intense builds, or builds that can pretty much run without guns most of the time anyway, like Getaway Artist. Unless you know what you're doing, one primary and one special weapon only. You are going to want something to kill ads with that is not in the DPS phase, and primaries are just the best weapon to do it. Speaking of not going off the deep end, we're gonna talk consistency. Do not put yourself in over your head just because you want to do optimal DPS. The best rotation for you is going to be the one that gives you the highest consistent damage. No one cares if you can do literally a bajillion damage if you can only do it 10% of the time. Because when the DPS phase rolls around, odds are good that you're just gonna fumble the bag. Also serves to reiterate my point about practice. Aim for consistency and peak value, but do so strictly in that order. Finally, the number one tip that I have outside of practice is dead DPS is no DPS. If you cannot survive long enough to get to the damage phase, you either need to get your skills up or you need to change your build. It is far, far more worth it to just use Skull Fort for solo Puppeteer than to try and be optimal with Quirus and die because you didn't have any healing. This is why I recommend Devour for Priz Warlocks. It is one of, if not the best survival tools in the game. Also, if you're going with an explosive-based strategy, or if anyone on your team is doing an explosive-based strategy, stop f***ing moving during the damage phase! No! Yes, it is tempting to jiggle around like you're hyped up on 9 Red Bulls, but you will get your teammates killed if you don't take the utmost care when you do so. At the very least, if you know you're gonna have to move, try to stand behind your teammates so they don't accidentally blow themselves up with the back of your head. And finally, you should subscribe to It Me Onyx. Okay, this won't actually improve your DPS, but if you got something out of this guide, I would appreciate your support. This thing took way longer to make than I think I'd like to admit, and if you got something out of it, I'd appreciate if you showed it some love by commenting or even just liking the video. If you want to support the future of this channel, I do have a link to donate to my Ko-Fi in the description. If you're feeling so inclined and you're in a good financial position to do so, please check that out. I hope the video was at least entertaining if it wasn't helpful to you. Hopefully the next episode of Bridging the Gap won't be nearly as long as this one, though. No promises. All right. I think that's everything. So I'll see you in the next one. Happy hunting. Bye for now.
We can't use exclusively negative reinforcement.
Chili. The shoot
Chili,
good.
I like how much room you leave for yourself to grow.
I just ate a French fry. You're gonna kill me.